sometimes you just get it. You can read English, you can write it, but when it comes to actually speaking, it's like your tongue gets tied or something.
It's like stage fright almost.
Exactly. And that's what we're tackling in today's deep dive.
Yeah, we're looking at this really popular English learning podcast.
Okay.
And they have some amazing advice that is so practical.
Really?
You can actually start using it like right away.
So no more of that. I'm going to wait until I'm perfect before I even try.
Right. It's not about what to learn in English. It's like, how do you actually get it out of your mouth?
Oh, so it's like having a coach in your pocket?
Exactly, like a fluency coach.
Okay, I'm all ears. So tell me, where do we start with this whole fluency training thing?
Well, the first thing they hit on is something that holds so many people back.
What's that?
It's the fear of making mistakes.
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
Like you're so worried about saying something wrong that you just don't speak at all.
I feel seen right now.
Right, and this podcast is like, chuck that perfectionism out the window.
But
instead of waiting to be perfect, just start speaking.
okay, but how?
They have this thing called the 5-minute rule.
5-minute rule.
Basically, you commit to speaking English for at least 5 minutes every single day.
Every day.
Doesn't matter what you talk about. You can literally narrate your breakfast to your cat.
Okay, could see how they would get you in the habit of using the language.
It's about progress, not perfection.
I love that.
So you're making speaking a habit
Okay.
instead of this big, scary performance.
So it's like replacing perfect with practice.
Exactly.
I'm curious, does the podcast give like specific ways to use this 5-minute rule?
They do. They have all sorts of ideas.
Like what?
Well, they talk about like describing your actions as you're doing them.
Oh, so kind of like giving a play-by-play of your own life.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of just thinking I'm making dinner, you'd be like, okay, chopping those veggies, now I'm adding some spices.
Now you're talking.
It makes you more aware of how you're using the language.
Interesting. And it seems like that ties in perfectly with their next point.
You got it thinking in English.
Okay, I'll admit that one sounds a little intimidating at first.
It might sound like a big leap, but it's all about training your brain.
Okay.
Our brains are amazing. They can adapt to new languages.
So the more you use English, even in your head, the more natural it becomes.
Exactly. You're kind of rewiring your brain for English.
So instead of mentally translating from my native language, I'm training my brain to just think in English.
Exactly. And you don't have to start with some big complex thoughts.
So start small.
Super small, like name objects around you in English, or think about a simple decision in English, like should I wear the blue shirt or the red one?
Oh, that's actually really doable.
It's like creating a mini English world inside your head.
Like building those English muscles, even when you're not speaking out loud.
Exactly. And speaking of training, the podcast talks a lot about active listening.
Okay, so what does active listening mean in this context?
Well, it's more than just passively hearing English.
So what's the active part?
It's about engaging with the language, like really paying attention to how it's used.
Okay.
They talk about a technique called shadowing.
Shadowing? What's that?
It's where you listen to a native speaker and you try to mimic them in real time.
So you're copying their pronunciation, their intonation, everything.
Got it. It's like having a vocal coach right there with you.
Oh, okay.
And the podcast even recommends some great resources for this.
Like what?
Things like the BBC Learning English podcast. There are also some awesome YouTube channels like Speak English with Vanessa or English Addict with Mr. Steve.
Yeah, those are all great for getting exposed to natural spoken English.
And that's the key to really improving your fluency.
It's all about immersing yourself in the language.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about speaking, thinking, listening. What about vocabulary?
Vocabulary. The building blocks of any language.
Do they recommend, like, memorizing those giant lists of words?
Actually, they say that's not the most effective way to learn.
Really?
Yeah, they suggest focusing on everyday phrases and learning synonyms for words you already know.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they also highlight something called phrasal verbs.
Phrasal verbs. I always get tripped up by those.
Yeah, they can be tricky.
Can you give me a quick refresher on what those are?
Sure. So they're basically combinations of verbs with prepositions or adverbs.
Okay.
And they create a whole new meaning, like give up, put off, look into.
Right. So the meaning isn't always obvious just from the individual words.
Exactly. And they're so common in everyday conversations.
You know, now that you mention it, I remember when I learned the phrasal verb figure out. It was like this big aha moment.
Sometimes learning a new phrasal verb is like unlocking a whole new level of fluency.
It's like you suddenly have the words to express yourself more clearly.
Right, and that's what fluency is all about.
So phrasal verbs are definitely worth adding to the fluency toolkit.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered speaking, thinking, listening, vocabulary. What else is there?
Well, this podcast doesn't shy away from the topic of pronunciation and intonation.
Well, those can be tough, especially when you're worried about sounding native.
Yeah, a lot of people get hung up on accents.
Like, do I need to sound British or American or Australian?
Right, but this podcast emphasizes that clarity is more important than mimicking a specific accent.
So it's about being understood?
Exactly, and using intonation to convey meaning.
Okay, but how do they suggest we improve our pronunciation without focusing on a specific accent?
Well, they recommend some really practical exercises like recording yourself speaking and comparing it to native speakers.
So you can hear the differences.
Yeah, and you can really focus on those tricky sounds that trip up non-native speakers.
Like the TH sound.
Yeah, that one's a classic.
Or the difference between V and W or R and L.
Those can be tough.
Okay. But I'm starting to see a pattern here.
What's that?
It seems like this podcast is all about taking those things that we find scary or intimidating
Yeah.
and breaking them down into small, manageable steps.
It's like they're saying, hey, this might feel daunting, but you can do this.
I'm really liking their approach.
Me too. And there's another piece of advice that I think really highlights this philosophy.
Oh, tell me.
They actually encourage you to slow down.
Slow down.
Yeah, it might sound counterintuitive, right?
Because we associate fluency with speed.
Exactly. But rushing through your sentences can make you harder to understand.
It's like trying to cram a whole sentence into one breath.
And it can make you feel more flustered.
Okay, so slowing down helps with clarity.
Absolutely.
And it probably helps you feel more relaxed.
Exactly. And they even suggest pausing between thoughts and emphasizing keywords.
So it's about quality, not quantity.
You got it.
You know, it's funny because sometimes when I hear someone speaking English really quickly,
Yeah.
it can actually be harder to follow.
Absolutely.
So maybe slowing down is the secret to sounding more fluent.
It could be. And speaking of secrets, this podcast has some fun tips for creating what they call a mini English world in your daily life.
A mini English world. Tell me more.
It's about surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible, even outside of dedicated study time.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, they talk about simple things like switching your phone settings to English,
Oh, that's a good one.
or writing your to-do list in English, or even following English-speaking content creators on social media.
It's like building that immersion without having to travel to an English-speaking country.
Exactly. It's about making English a part of your daily life.
You know, I remember when I was learning Spanish, I started listening to Spanish music in the car.
Uh-huh.
It really helped me get used to the sounds of the language.
It's those little things that can make a big difference.
And they can be fun, too.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about speaking, listening, vocabulary pronunciation, pacing, immersion.
We've covered a lot.
But there's one thing that this podcast really emphasizes that I think ties everything together.
Mindset.
You read my mind, they talk a lot about the importance of confidence.
Yeah, they point out that even native speakers make mistakes.
Oh, that's comforting to hear.
It's easy to get caught up in this idea of needing to be perfect.
Ah.
But the reality is everyone makes mistakes. It's part of being human.
So it's about shifting that mindset.
Exactly, from I need to be perfect to I'm learning and growing.
It's about embracing the journey.
And that's a much more enjoyable way to learn a language.
Well, this has been a great overview of the podcast's philosophy.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, there's so much more to explore.
So what's next?
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll be diving into some more advanced techniques.
Ooh, sounds good.
We'll look at how to refine your speaking skills.
Okay, I'm ready.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. So we've talked about those core principles, the foundation for building fluency.
Yeah, it's like we've got this solid base camp set up.
Exactly. And now we're ready to start exploring some more challenging terrain.
Okay, I'm excited. Where do we head next on this fluency trek?
Well, this podcast dives into something they call active vocabulary versus passive vocabulary.
Active versus passive. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So you know how you might recognize a word when you see it written or hear it spoken?
Yeah, like, I understand what it means.
But then when you try to use it in a conversation, it's like...
It's gone poof, vanished into thin air.
Exactly. It's like you have this giant vocabulary library in your brain, but you can't seem to find the right book when you need it.
That's a great analogy.
So they talk about actively practicing with those words you already know.
So it's not just about learning new words.
It's also about making those words you already know more accessible.
Like building those pathways in your brain.
Exactly. And they suggest simple things like using those words in your daily conversations.
So make a conscious effort to use them.
Yeah, even if it feels a little forced at first.
You know, I've heard that using new words in a slightly exaggerated way can help you remember them.
Like you're acting out the word.
Yeah, it kind of makes it more memorable.
I think there's something to that. It's like you're engaging more of your brain.
Right, and sometimes a little silliness can help with learning.
Absolutely. But beyond individual words, this podcast also talks about the power of idioms and expressions.
Oh, yeah. Those can be tricky, especially for non-native speakers.
Because their meaning isn't always literal.
It's like you need to crack the code.
Exactly. They're like little cultural puzzles.
And sometimes they're so different from my native language.
Right, but they add so much flavor to the language.
They make you sound more natural, more like a native speaker.
Exactly. And this podcast encourages you to start collecting idioms and expressions.
Like building a treasure chest of linguistic gems.
I love that. And they say the best way to learn them is to hear them in context.
So pay attention when you're watching movies or listening to podcasts.
Yeah, or even just eavesdropping on conversations.
It's like being a linguistic detective.
And once you start noticing them, you'll be amazed at how often they pop up.
I bet. And speaking of things that pop up, this podcast also talks about the importance of storytelling.
Storytelling, yeah, it's such a powerful tool.
But I feel like for a lot of language learners, the idea of telling a story in English can be intimidating.
Oh, I totally get that.
Like, where do you even start?
Well, this podcast reassures you that it doesn't have to be some epic tale.
Okay, so start small.
Yeah, share a funny anecdote, describe a memorable experience, or even just retell a simple story you read or saw in a movie.
So it's about building that confidence with speaking.
Exactly, and it's a more natural way to practice than just focusing on grammar rules.
You know, I wish I had learned languages this way in school.
Me too. It's so much more engaging.
It's like you're turning language learning into a form of self-expression.
And that's when it really starts to click.
And speaking of clicking, this podcast talks about the importance of finding your tribe.
Finding your tribe, you mean like a community of language learners?
Exactly, those people who understand the joys and challenges of learning English.
Because let's face it, learning a language can be a roller coaster.
It really can. There are highs and lows.
And having a support system can make all the difference.
So where do they suggest we find these fellow language learners?
Well, they talk about online forums and local conversation groups.
Okay, so there are options for everyone.
Yeah, whether you prefer to connect online or in person.
It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly, and it's about surrounding yourself with people who are on the same journey.
Because we all need a little encouragement along the way.
Absolutely. And you know what else can be really helpful?
What's that?
Self-care.
Self-care.
Yeah, it might seem unrelated to language learning.
I wouldn't have thought of it.
But they emphasize the importance of taking care of yourself both mentally and physically.
Because learning a language can be tiring.
It can be really demanding, and if you're not taking care of yourself, you're more likely to burn out.
So it's about finding that balance between pushing yourself and giving yourself permission to rest.
Exactly, and they suggest things like mindfulness, exercise, spending time in nature.
Anything that helps you relax and de-stress.
Because when you're feeling good, you're more likely to learn effectively.
It's like you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. And speaking of things that can fill your cup, this podcast talks a lot about mindset.
Oh, mindset. That's so important.
It really is. They emphasize that your beliefs about yourself and your ability to learn can have a huge impact on your progress.
It's like whether you think you can or you think you can't. You're right.
Exactly. Our thoughts shape our reality.
And that's definitely true when it comes to language learning.
So they encourage you to cultivate a growth mindset.
To believe that you can learn and improve.
Even when you face setbacks.
Because setbacks are inevitable.
You're part of the process.
And it's about seeing those setbacks as opportunities for growth.
Exactly, not as proof that you're not good enough.
And it's about celebrating those small wins.
Every step forward is a victory.
You know, I'm really impressed with how this podcast manages to weave these deeper themes of mindset and self-care into what could have easily been just a list of tips and tricks.
Yeah, it feels like a more holistic approach to language learning.
It's about recognizing that fluency is about more than just grammar and vocabulary.
It's about the whole person.
It's about the journey, the ups and downs, the challenges and triumphs.
And ultimately, it's about connection, expressing yourself, and expanding your horizons.
And speaking of expanding our horizons, we're about to embark on the final leg of our deep dive into this amazing podcast.
Get ready for some final thoughts and insights that will take your English fluency to new heights.
We've talked about mindset, active vocabulary, storytelling, even self-care.
It's like we've been given this incredible toolbox for fluency.
Right, and like any good toolbox, it's got all these different tools for different jobs.
And this podcast really encourages you to find what works best for you.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. It's about becoming your own language learning scientist.
Okay, I like that. So how do we become language learning scientists?
Well, they suggest things like experimenting with different techniques.
So trying things out, seeing what sticks.
Exactly, and paying attention to what helps you learn best.
So it's about being curious and observant.
And they even recommend keeping a language learning journal.
Oh, that's a great idea. I used to do that when I was learning.
It's a great way to track your progress and your challenges.
And to celebrate those little wins.
Exactly. It helps you become more aware of your own learning process.
So you're not just passively going through the motions.
You're actively engaged in the journey.
You know, speaking of being active, there's one piece of advice from this podcast that I think is really important.
What's that?
They talk about the power of feedback.
Feedback? Oh, yeah, that's so crucial.
But I'll admit, I usually think of feedback in like a formal setting.
Like from a teacher or a boss.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does feedback work in the context of language learning?
Well, they suggest seeking out feedback from native speakers or experienced teachers.
So getting an outside perspective on your English.
Exactly, because sometimes we're so close to our own learning process.
That we can't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly, and having someone else point out those subtle things.
Like pronunciation or grammar mistakes.
Or even just ways to express yourself more naturally.
That can be so valuable.
And they recommend things like language exchange partners, online tutors, even just asking English-speaking friends for their honest opinions.
So there are a lot of different ways to get feedback.
Yeah, the key is to be open to it. And to remember that it's not criticism.
It's a way to help you grow.
Exactly.
You know, as we're talking about growth and feedback, I'm reminded of one of the core messages of this podcast.
Which is?
That fluency is a journey, not a destination.
It's an ongoing process.
And they emphasize that even native speakers are still learning.
Always evolving their language skills.
So it's not about reaching some imaginary endpoint.
It's about constantly growing and exploring.
I love that perspective. It takes the pressure off.
Right, because there's no such thing as perfect English.
It's about finding your own voice within the language.
And expressing yourself authentically.
You know, this whole deep dive has been so inspiring.
I feel like we've been given this amazing roadmap to fluency.
And not just in English, but in any language.
Because a lot of these principles are universal.
It's about mindset, it's about practice, it's about community.
It's about embracing the journey.
And as we wrap up this episode, I just want to say, I feel so grateful for all the insights we've gained from this podcast.
Me too. It's been a real treasure trove of information.
And I hope our listeners feel empowered to take their English fluency to the next level.
Because fluency is within everyone's reach.
It's just a matter of taking those first steps.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey.
There's a whole community of language learners out there cheering you on.
So go out there, embrace the challenge, and never stop exploring.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into unlocking English fluency.
We hope you enjoyed it.
And we'll see you next time for another exciting adventure in the world of language learning.
Happy speaking.